when you have been lied about for a series of years, imagine that for over a period of months and years, and you know that it isn't true. Did you make Kate cry?
No, the reverse happened. Kate was called Waity Katie, waiting to marry William.
Picture the scene in early 2021. The world, silenced by lockdowns and fear, suddenly jolted awake by a conversation filmed in a lush California garden. What looked at first like a quiet interview soon revealed itself to be the opening act of a media detonation. At its center sat Meghan Markle, across from the most powerful woman in American television, Oprah Winfrey. And then, slowly, deliberately, Meghan began to speak. Her words carried the weight of accusation, every phrase cutting like a blade against the ancient heart of the British monarchy. She did not simply describe her loneliness or her sense of being trapped within a system she called cold and unfeeling. She went further, pulling back the curtain on a family that had long hidden its secrets behind ritual and silence. What followed was nothing less than a public indictment, a narrative carefully framed by tears and pauses that seemed to echo across millions of living rooms. And then came the revelation that detonated like a charge of dynamite on the eve of her wedding. It was Catherine, the Duchess, praised for her flawless composure and perfect smile, who had reduced her to tears. With a single statement, Meghan inverted the roles, recasting herself as the wronged woman, and Catherine as the silent villain. In that instant, the world split down the middle. On one side, Meghan was crowned a brave victim, daring enough to challenge an empire built on centuries of silence. On the other, Catherine was suddenly painted as the icy face of a merciless machine. And yet, as powerful as this moment was, no one watching realized they were witnessing the spark that would ignite a storm. A media earthquake whose tremors would continue to shake the monarchy for years to come. The explosion was immediate and merciless. Within hours of the broadcast, Meghan's words were everywhere. Headlines screamed across continents. Clips replayed on an endless loop. And social media lit up with a frenzy that no palace wall could withstand. The carefully crafted image of a centuries-old monarchy was shattered in real time, replaced by the portrait of a family cold, archaic, and hostile to those who dared not fit its mold. For millions, the interview did not feel like television. It felt like a trial, and the verdict had already been delivered. The most incendiary charge of all the claim that senior royals had speculated about the skin tone of Meghan's unborn child tore through the institution's reputation like wildfire. In an era where perception often weighs more than fact, the accusation of racism was a wound that could not be bandaged. Overnight, the monarchy was not just questioned, it was condemned. And as if that were not enough, Meghan's revelation that Catherine had made her cry before the wedding cast a long shadow over the future queen, creating an irresistible narrative of two women locked in a cruel inversion of roles, one a victim, the other a villain. The machinery of global media, insatiable and ruthless, fed on every tear, every pause, every detail. Newspapers, talk shows, and podcasts dissected the interview with surgical precision, amplifying its most explosive moments. Online, armies of voices clashed like rival factions in a civil war of perception. To one side, Meghan became an icon, the outsider who had dared to speak truth to power. To the other, Catherine was reduced to a cold antagonist, condemned not by her words, but by her silence. And in that silence, the divide grew wider, sharper, almost irreconcilable. Buckingham Palace had weathered storms before scandals, divorces, even the death of Diana, but nothing like this. The interview struck at the very heart of its identity, and for the first time in generations, the monarchy seemed fragile, exposed, almost mortal. The halls of Windsor and the corridors of Buckingham trembled, not from cannon fire or political upheaval, but from the relentless barrage of public opinion. What had once been whispered in private drawing rooms was now shouted across the world. The crown was cruel, outdated, and perhaps even irrelevant. The palace response was as brief as it was calculated. A single statement, issued in the Queen's name, containing the now infamous phrase, "Recollections may vary." It was elegant, restrained, and yet devastating in its own way, a masterstroke of passive-aggressive diplomacy. Without ever uttering the words directly, the monarchy had called Meghan and Harry liars, but the very restraint of the reply only fanned the flames. To those who already doubted the institution, it sounded cold, detached, dismissive. To its defenders, it was a necessary line in the sand. And so, the battle of narratives only intensified. Meanwhile, Catherine carried the heaviest burden in silence. Each photograph of her at a school visit, each wave to the crowds at an official engagement, was reframed through the lens of the accusations. The woman once celebrated as the embodiment of composure was now recast as the villainess of a modern fairy tale gone wrong. And yet, behind the palace walls, the rules of the game remained unchanged. Never complain. Never explain. The monarchy did not step into the arena of public debate. It simply endured, as it had for centuries, trusting that time and silence could outlast the fury of the moment. She never said a word, and yet her silence was louder than any statement could have been. In the wake of Meghan's televised revelations, Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, was transformed almost overnight into the perfect antagonist of a modern tragedy. The smile that had once been praised as serene now looked, through the new filter of suspicion, like a mask concealing icy calculation. Every public appearance became a performance scrutinized by millions, a raised eyebrow at an official ceremony, a polite laugh at a charity visit, even the way she held her children's hands in public. All of it was twisted into evidence of a coldness that had supposedly driven her sister-in-law to tears. The cruelty of the transformation lay in its simplicity. If Meghan was the victim, then Catherine had to be the villain. There was no room for nuance, no space for complexity in a narrative. This intoxicating, she became the silent villain, condemned not by her actions, but by her inability to defend herself, bound by the ancient code of the crown. Never complain. I never explain, Catherine was forbidden to speak. Her silence, meant to project dignity and endurance, instead became a blank canvas on which the public painted their darkest assumptions. Imagine the psychological weight of that silence. To be accused before the entire world of making a pregnant woman cry, to have strangers debate your character in headlines and hashtags, and to wake each morning knowing you must step out in flawless attire, offer gracious smiles, and carry on as though nothing had happened. It was not merely public scrutiny. It was a slow, relentless form of character assassination, executed in plain sight. And yet, she endured. Behind the golden bars of monarchy, Catherine absorbed the storm with unflinching composure, her suffering hidden in plain sight, her dignity becoming both her shield and her prison. For decades, Oprah Winfrey's name had been synonymous with trust. Her word carried weight across continents. Her interviews were treated as gospel, and her empathy was her greatest weapon. But empathy, as she would discover, can also be a weakness. As the months passed, and the narrative of Meghan and Harry began to unravel at its seams, whispers emerged from Montecito. Oprah was restless. She had begun to revisit the interview that once defined her career, and what she saw now was no longer triumph, but liability. Close friends, speaking in hushed tones to the press, suggested that Oprah felt something she had rarely admitted in public: regret. Not because the interview had failed. On the contrary, it had been a global spectacle. The regret came from the possibility that she had allowed herself to be swept away, carried by the tide of a story too powerful. too emotionally seductive to question in the moment. She wondered if she had lowered her guard. If her hunger to deliver the interview of the decade had blinded her to the warning signs any seasoned journalist should have noticed. This was not just about Meghan and Harry anymore. For Oprah, it was about legacy. Every empire she had built rested on a single foundation: credibility. And now, as she looked back on that idyllic California garden and the tears that had shocked the world, a single question gnawed at her relentlessly: had she been the messenger of truth, or the unwitting architect of a carefully woven illusion? By the time 2025 arrived, the unease had swollen into something impossible to ignore. The whispers surrounding Oprah's regret no longer belonged only to private conversations or industry rumor mills. They began leaking into Hollywood circles, splashed across blind items and speculative think pieces. Something was coming. That much was clear. And everyone knew that when Oprah moved, she did not move lightly. She had the power to turn a private doubt into a global reckoning. And the anticipation of that possibility charged the air like the silence before a storm. The production itself was cloaked in secrecy. No official announcements. No trailers. No hints of the content, only a cryptic promise of a live broadcast, billed not as a retrospective, nor an interview, but as an event. Studios in Los Angeles buzzed with gossip. Montecito trembled with anxiety. And in London, even the palace reportedly tightened its ranks. No one knew what Oprah would say, but everyone sensed it would be monumental. After all, this was the same woman who had once detonated the monarchy's public image with a single interview. What could she possibly reveal now that would demand an even bigger stage for Harry and Meghan? The countdown was suffocating. They had built an empire on the credibility that Oprah had lent them, and now that very foundation threatened to collapse under their feet. They monitored every rumor, every whisper, every shift in tone across the media landscape, knowing instinctively that their greatest ally might soon become their gravest threat. And across the ocean, in the stillness of Kensington Palace, Catherine remained silent, as she had always been, but for the first time in years. The silence seemed heavy with possibility. The stage was set. Millions would soon be watching. Oprah, haunted by her own conscience, was preparing to step back into the spotlight, not as the architect of a narrative, but as its demolitionist. And when the lights came up, the truth, whatever it was, would be unleashed. When the night finally arrived, the world seemed to hold its breath. Cameras cut to a stage bathed in muted light, stripped of glamour, as though even the set itself understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Oprah Winfrey walked out slowly, not with the commanding stride that had defined her for decades, but with the weight of a woman carrying a burden too long ignored. There was no applause, only a tense, expectant silence that pressed in from every corner of the broadcast. Millions of eyes watched as the most trusted voice in television stood before them, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. She began cautiously, her voice trembling, speaking not of names, but of principles, truth, responsibility, the immense power of storytelling. And then came the pause, the kind of silence only Oprah could wield, stretched long enough to make viewers lean forward, hearts pounding. When she finally broke it, she did not hide behind titles or protocol. She spoke a single name, softly but unmistakably Catherine. Not the Duchess of Cambridge, not the Princess of Wales, just Catherine. The woman, the mother, the figure who had been cast as a villain without ever uttering a defense. And then Oprah did what no one imagined possible. She apologized. It was no vague corporate apology, no carefully hedged statement. It was raw, direct, devastating. She confessed that in 2021 she had failed to press harder, failed to question inconsistencies, failed to protect a woman who had been unable to defend herself. Her empathy, she admitted, had clouded her judgment. Her desire to give voice to pain had blinded her to the warning signs any journalist should have seen. "For that," she said, voice breaking, "for the pain I caused. Another woman. Another mother. I am deeply sorry." In that moment, the world shifted. Oprah did not need to call Meghan a liar. She did not need to dismantle the story point by point. By turning her judgment inward, by admitting her own professional failure, she pulled the foundation out from under the entire narrative. The castle of cards Meghan had built did not crumble because Oprah attacked it. It collapsed because Oprah stepped away. The audience watching knew instantly the truth had just changed. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Even before Oprah stepped off the stage, the digital world ignited. Social media feeds exploded. News outlets scrambled to rewrite their front pages. And the narrative that had dominated public discourse for 4 years collapsed in real time. Meghan and Harry, once hailed as modern-day rebels, found themselves suddenly alone, suspended in the wreckage of a story that no longer held. Their credibility, once their most powerful currency, evaporated like mist under a harsh new light. Hollywood, that fickle empire of image and narrative, began to retreat. Production deals were quietly shelved. Brands distanced themselves. Invitations slowed. The couple who had once commanded a global stage now found themselves isolated, not by a royal family, but by a public that had been given permission to question what it had so fervently believed. And the most devastating blow, it hadn't come from critics or tabloids, it had come from Oprah herself. The same voice that had elevated them to icons had now, with calm precision, dismantled the myth they had wrapped around themselves. Meanwhile, in London, there was no fanfare, no statements, no celebratory victory laps. But in the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, the weight of 4 long years finally lifted. Catherine, whose name had been dragged through the mud without once opening her mouth, was vindicated not through retaliation, but through time. Her silence, once interpreted as complicity, it was now understood for what it had been all along: dignity. In the end, she didn't need to fight. The truth had fought for her. And the monarchy, that ancient institution long accused of being out of step with the modern world, emerged with an unlikely kind of victory, not through spin, not through spectacle, but through patience. While Meghan and Harry had played the fast game of public sympathy, the Crown had played the long game of history. It had endured quietly and strategically, waiting for the tide to turn. And when it did, it turned with the force of revelation. This wasn't just the end of a feud. It was a masterclass in how truth is shaped, bent, sold, and ultimately reclaimed. A lesson in the terrifying power of media to build myths, and just as easily, to destroy them. And so, the story that once captivated the world comes to a quiet, sobering close, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with silence, broken only by the weight of truth finally landing where it always belonged. What began as a tale of royal injustice, of a woman against a palace, has unraveled into something far more complex, a cautionary tale about perception, power, and the devastating speed at which stories, once believed, can turn on those who told them. Meghan and Harry sought to escape the palace, but instead built a new prison, one made not of protocol, but of narrative. And when that narrative fell, so did the protection it offered. Catherine, the woman who had endured in silence, did not seek revenge. She never raised her voice. And yet, in the end, it was her silence that spoke loudest. As for Oprah, her confession will be remembered not as a betrayal, but as an act of rare courage in an age of curated truth. She reminded us that credibility is not built in moments of triumph, but in moments of reckoning. This was never just a royal scandal. It was a mirror held up to a world that too often mistakes emotion for evidence, and spectacle for truth. And perhaps, just perhaps. The greatest legacy of this saga is the reminder that in time, the truth does not need to shout. It always finds its way to the surface.